Today we're going to examine some of the slavery laws in Virginia from the 1600s and the 1700s. And what we're trying to see is what, if at all, do we see change over time that corresponds with the growth in the population of slaves in Virginia. You can see only 23 in 1625. 1619 was the first year that slaves arrived on the shores in Virginia. 300 about 20 years later. And then when it's only about 3,000 in 1680, there's a huge jump to 1700. And when we get all the way down to 1775, right before the Revolution, we have over 200,000 slaves in Virginia. So when we look at the growth in these laws, how it's changing, what's key is the way in which these headlines have changed things. So early on in North America, in the British colonies, we had a lot of indentured servitude, right? And indentured servitude is something that someone is a temporary condition that they are in, and they can earn their way out. So servitude is what many people from Europe signed up to pay off their debts for the trip to America, and that's how they would earn their quote-unquote freedom and then become a landowner. But this idea of servant for life was a new phenomenon, and status changed from just being in a temporary condition of servant to all of a sudden servant for life. And one of the things that changed was the difference between black women and English women. Blacks faced the possibility of life servitude. The General Assembly of Virginia decides that any child born to an enslaved woman will also be a slave. So what does that say? That you are born a slave if you are a black person born into this country, if your mother is a slave. And that is something that the condition of the mother becomes a sticking point. That becomes the reason why someone becomes a slave or not. Not if they've done something wrong, not that they're sold into slavery, but you are born a slave. So we have the cognitive kind of dissonance for many of these people that they are Christians, that they are God-fearing people, that they believe in the dignity of the human beings, but yet at the same time, they have life servitude simply because someone is born to an enslaved woman. That is something that really begins to increase the numbers as more and more people are slaves for their entire life. One of the things that you see escalate towards the end of the 1700s is further restricting the freedom of blacks. Okay, why would they be further restricting the freedom of the blacks? Okay, there's a concern. Virginia lawmakers say baptism does not bring freedom to blacks. So now you have a situation where you can be baptized, be a Christian, and still be a slave. It's really wild. But that was something that early on, many Christian slave owners would somehow convince themselves that they were helping their slaves that they owned get to the promised land, and therefore they were doing their duty. But this is something that was a reaction to the fact that in the 1640s and 1650s, many slaves who had become baptized had argued for their freedom because of the fact that they were deemed equal in the eyes of the Lord. Legislators encouraged slave owners to Christianize their enslaved men and women, and therefore this was a way to prevent them from gaining their freedom. Free black women, like enslaved females over the age of 16, are deemed tithable. Tithable meaning you can receive money for them. Okay, they can be loaned out for work. Okay, freedom does not exempt black women from taxation. An act about casual killing of slaves says that if a slave dies while resisting his master, the act will not be presumed to have occurred with prepense malice. Okay, so casual killing of slaves is an interesting way to refer to something. But the casual killing of slaves is the way in which they are legalizing murder. And they are legalizing the ability for slave owners to kill their slaves because of the fact that it is, in the eyes of the law, you are destroying your property. Here, once again, another fear that free blacks may be increasing their power. So the concern about power of free blacks gaining when there is not an incredible amount of population in the colonies, that's the major concern. So what happens here? So this is interesting in the fact that right after Nathaniel Bacon's rebellion, it becomes legal to wound or kill an enslaved person who resists arrest, right? So that's one thing. But shortly after that, you have slave laws reflect racism and the deliberate separation of blacks and white. Color all of a sudden becomes the determining factor, and there's a conscious effort to rigidly police slave conduct. So the fear of the rebellion by Nathaniel Bacon, what was the fear? The concern about Nathaniel Bacon's rebellion was that you had the poor whites and slaves and indentured servants rallying together to fight against the landowning class. This is a concern of the landowning class. They are fearful that if you allow these groups to commingle, to cohabitate, to grow in affection for one another, you might be in a situation where you are outnumbered. So the laws start to create a separation. Racism and segregation are largely about keeping people separate because separation leads to ignorance. If you're ignorant of your neighbor, if you're ignorant of someone from a different background simply because you never meet them, then it's easier for the powers that be to convince us that you are my enemy or that you are my the competitor for what I'm trying to do for my family. Okay, so that's important. The other thing is you start to see an increase in the way in which slaves are policed. So no longer are you given the freedoms to do what you wanted. All of a sudden you have situations where you literally have a hall pass. You literally need permission to leave the plantation. Without written permission, 20 lashes on one's back. So they start to create a penal code based on whether or not you are obeying by the rules to protect white society. If an outlying slave is killed while resisting capture, the owner receives financial compensation, once again. So if your slave runs away, someone kills him, it's no big deal. You get reimbursed. Okay, so it's very interesting the way it works. Okay, this right here, partners in an interracial marriage cannot stay in the colony for more than 3 months after they are married. So you are banished if you are part of an interracial marriage. Okay, why? Because that does not allow the current system where whites are superior to blacks and blacks are rigidly separated. That ruins the situation that they are trying to uphold. And as we see here, you see the way in which all of a sudden we hear the term mulatto for the first time here. A mulatto child born to a white indentured servant will serve 30-year indenture. Okay? So if you're an indentured servant who has a child who is born of a white indentured servant, meaning a white woman, that child will be punished by serving 30 years in servitude. Okay? A master must transport an emancipated slave out of Virginia within 6 months of receiving his or her freedom. No free blacks allowed. Okay? Because that's the reason why they don't want free blacks allowed is they fear the way in which a uprising could occur if there's too many free blacks. Okay? Slaves are denied the right to a trial a jury trial for capital offenses. Capital offenses like murder, okay, anything that is punishable by death. A minimum of 4 justices of the peace hear evidence and determine the fate of the accused. Legislators also decide that enslaved individuals are not permitted to own horses, cattle, hogs after December 31 of that year. Okay, those things are things that you could use to sustain your own farm. Okay, so they completely strip away the ability for you to be independent. Why? Because then you have to work for them, and then they can take advantage of your labor. Independence is denied. Okay, 1705. We are not a country yet, but free men of color lose the right to hold public office. Blacks, free and enslaved, are denied the right to testify as witnesses, because why would anybody trust a person that is inferior to be a witness? All black, mulatto, and Indian slaves are considered property. Okay, that's something we'll revisit in the 1800s. Enslaved men are not allowed to serve in the militia. Okay, so segregation, as I mentioned before, is the goal of all these things. By keeping people separate, you can prevent an uprising of the poor and working classes. By keeping poor whites and the disadvantaged and suppressed blacks that are enslaved and free, this is a way of maintaining the status quo. Take a look at this. Determine that if a white man or white woman marries a black partner, the white individual will be sent to jail for 6 months and fined 10 pounds current money of Virginia. Okay. And then right above that, increase the indenture of a mulatto child born to a white woman to 31 years. 1705, I guess 30 years wasn't enough from earlier. So it's very interesting the way they create these laws. What's going on that's allowing this? The most likely scenario is they're trying to control the behavior of African Americans, control the behavior of enslaved people. Why? Because they fear an uprising. They fear a response. They fear, in the back of their minds, you'll see this throughout American history, the way in which slave owners and people who are perpetrating injustice, they have this weird fear consistently of retribution. So when you treat people terribly, you end up being fearful that people will treat you the way you treat them. And that is what all these laws are about: control and social order, and maintaining the hierarchy that we spoke about last week, where whites are supreme and all others are beneath. So white supremacy is what all of these rules are about. And the fact that now the birth of an individual to an enslaved person is now a slave for life dramatically changes the way in which individuals, as well as the growth of slavery, occur in Virginia and